This is the GGJ Podcast, a show about the games industry, the people who make them, and the communities that grow up around them. I'm Susan Gold, a game education trailblazer and one of the founders of the Global Game Jam. Each week, we sit down with a new guest, highlighting their own path and journey. This is a space for honest conversation from makers about creativity, collaboration, failure, and the messy, the beautiful reality of making games. So whether you're a young dev or seasoned, an educator, a student, or someone who just loves games and the people behind them, welcome to the GGJ Podcast. Take a breath, settle in, and let's hear directly from the makers themselves.
This episode is made possible in partnership with the Global Game Jam, the world's largest game creation event, bringing together creators from around the globe. A big thank you as well to the Global Game Jam's headline sponsors, Epic Games, Games for Change, and Xsola, for helping make this creative community a reality. To learn more and to get involved in the upcoming jams, visit globalgamejam.org. This episode is brought to you in part through the support of the University of Miami School of Communication and the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation.
Pablo Quarta is an Argentine writer, narrative designer, and game producer based in Buenos Aires. They have spent more than 8 years in independent games, specializing in story, structure, world building, and character-driven design. Their work uses games as tools to think about labor, climate justice, queerness, and Latin American realities. He is best known for co-founding Matajuegos, a bilingual blog and indie game co-op dedicated to critical writing about games, and for producing the award-winning surreal documentary video game Atuel. And they've become a respectful festival speaker and advocate for co-ops and socially engaging game making. Pablo, welcome to the GGJ podcast. It is a pleasure to have you here and to dive into your journey from co-ops and criticism to hyperlocal documentary games and the future you're helping reimagine.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to have been invited and to have the space to talk with you and to chat.
Thank you. Where are you joining us from today? And tell us a little bit about who you are.
I'm joining from Buenos Aires, Argentina, so all the way down south of the very southern tip of South America. And like you said in your intro, I'm a narrative designer. I'm a producer working mainly in indie video games, but I've worked on commercial games, games with big IPs like Star Trek. But over the last few years, I've mostly been concentrating on social, cultural, and political games with my colleagues at Matajuegos.
So, for listeners who haven't seen or heard of your work yet, let's talk about your projects and what you're most associated with right now.
Yeah, so I think the latest project that I've been involved with that is perhaps the most well-known one is Atuel, the surrealist documentary video game about the Atuel River in Argentina and about the climate crisis. In the game, you play as the Atuel River, which is born up in the Andes Mountains and flows west across the immense Cuyo Desert. You start off the game playing as the meltwater coming down the mountainside, and then you become different parts of its ecosystem, all while listening to clips of interviews with specialists like historians, geologists, activists, poets, who all speak about the past, the present, and the future of the region and about its current conflict with the climate crisis. And before that, in Matajuegos, we developed several video games with strong cultural, political, and social themes that all draw on the current Argentine and Latin American context. Games about Latin American youth and adolescence, games about unionizing in Argentina, games about local politics, and about our own autobiographical experiences living in Argentina during these times.
You started, though, as a critic more than as a maker, correct?
Not necessarily. So, about the same time that I started working in the video games industry, we also started Matajuego. So, it was something that was happening at the same time as my work developing video games professionally.
Ah, so why don't you walk us through Matajuegos? It's the first of its kind in Argentina, correct?
Yeah, so Matajuegos was born as an indie game dev collective here in Buenos Aires. It started off with just four of us meeting up at indie dev events And we were having a very similar dialogue within our small group about kind of the social scene around us and the indie dev events that we were a part of and that community. And there were two things that were happening that we were being drawn to. One was that we found that a lot of the games that were being made in our community, this was about 2015, were very proficient technically and made a lot of references to other games. They were kind of games that really felt that the innovation came from very good programming and very good mechanical design, kind of the more formal side of game development. But there was really no work being done in the substance, on the content side, and no innovation in storytelling or in connecting games to the real world. You know, we all came from other disciplines like films, like journalism, like literature, and we really wanted to make games that discussed, you know, the world that we inhabited. And we found that games in our community very much wanted to run away from the real world and only be games about games in a certain way, or games that made reference to previous games. And so we started making very small games about the real world, and we started writing about this. The other thing we found, you know, this was 2015, it was very shortly after Gamergate. And our community was mostly straight white middle class men. And there were, you know, a lot of attitudes that made it very hard from people from different backgrounds to be included in that community. And so we really wanted our community to start having these conversations. And we kind of forced it upon them by starting this blog, talking about these different kinds of games, where innovation could come from in games, and how to also make Latin American games with Latin American perspectives. Because we found that a lot of our peers wanted to make games that spoke to the global North imaginary, you know, games based in North America, games based in Europe, and the games that we grew up with in a lot of ways, because there hasn't been Latin American game production
But
for.
it doesn't tell your
Yeah.
stories. And if it does, it tells a very sanitized version of a story, you
Sure.
know?
Yeah, or a very stereotypical version or a very symbolic version. And we really wanted to just that, you know, by telling our own experiences, we don't have to tell stereotypical Latin American stories. We can just talk about our lives. And that is a way to talk about Latin American perspectives in games and make Latin American games. And so these were all things that were very present in the early days when we began this blog and we started writing about these issues. And we also started translating a lot of indie game developers and indie game critics who are doing really good work in English and in other languages to give our community a sense of the other kind of conversations that were happening outside of Argentina and outside of Latin America, which we felt was a very rich kind of discourse that was occurring that a lot of our community did not have access to. And that was the initial project with the blog, alongside our own indie game development that each of us was doing. And that started in 2016. And then in 2021, still in the throes of the lockdown and the pandemic here in Argentina, we became Argentina's first video game workers co-op, because a lot of the other conversations we were having on the blog were about labor and about labor rights and the idea that games need unions. And we saw that there was a lot of exploitation in our country in big game companies that we worked at or that our peers worked at. There was a lot of crunch, there was a lot of exploitation, there was a lot of abuse of power. A lot of people were leaving the industry and new people were coming in who had no idea of what their rights were. And as an endpoint of that conversation we were having on the blog and with our peers, we decided that since we wanted to formalize Matajuegos, we wanted to become a legal personhood in order to be able to receive grants and apply for funding, and also work in a more straightforward way with different institutions and clients and produce more ambitious games as a studio. We decided to incorporate as a co-op rather than a more traditional company.
In practical terms, what did co op actually mean for you? And how did ownership and decision making and dealing with money actually work day to day?
So, in the initial foundation of Matajuegos in 2016, there were four of us. For the co-op, we needed a few more people. At that time, worker co-ops needed a minimum of 7 people in order to incorporate. So we invited some of our frequent collaborators to join us in the co-op, and they said yes. So we had enough people to join. And so, for anyone who doesn't know, a workers co-op is a company like any company. The only big difference is that it's owned by its workers. That means every worker is also an owner, and all workers are owners in equal parts. You know, one worker can't have more ownership of the company than anybody else. And at the base of it, decisions are made in a legal, technical sense through consensus and through voting and through discussion. It is very much what if a company was a democracy in a sort of sense. And that is ideologically very inspiring and very hopeful. At the same time, it brings a lot of challenges, which are the challenges of any democracy, which means that communication is key. And it means that everybody needs to participate in a certain sense. And everyone is also responsible at the end of the day for what is happening within the company. The way Matajuegos was run, it was a very small company that was just getting off its feet and finding clients. And basically, within the studio, we took on several different projects, and different parts of the co-op were involved in different projects at the same time.
What kind of projects?
So some of them we've already mentioned. We worked with local educational institutes making games for their programs. One was a narrative card game about having difficult conversations with your friends, about adolescence, about sexual identity, about social media, and about having these close bonds as you grow up and are trying to figure out who you are and what you want to do with your life. This game is called Viaja, baraja. It's only available in Spanish, but it's up on itch if you're interested.
Did these types of projects, is that what helped you become more in line with the country's cultural programs and allowed you to get more subsidies and opportunities?
So Matajuegos from its beginning, both as a blog and as an indie game collective, we very much specialized in making games about social issues. So when we became a co-op and a company, this was our niche. There was really, these were the kind of projects that we were drawn to and that we felt that we could do better than anybody else within our region. So they were the kind of projects that the clients and collaborators really trusted us with. Yeah.
Do you think that the co-op model unlocked something different that allowed people around you to become more interested in your projects and you were able to bring in other artists, other writers, and other collaborators?
It definitely unlocked something. So we kind of became a co-op right as the government was starting to streamline the co-op model as a big reform that occurred during lockdown and after lockdown. And the recently reformed Ministry of Culture in Argentina, the government institution that is responsible for managing co-ops, they began to work together to create the model of cultural co-ops. So co-ops to formalize the cultural industries in Argentina. This means music groups, theater groups, cultural centers, and any kind of industry whose main business is culture. And this also included video games. And we were the very first video game co op to come in as part of that program. This allowed us to interface with the Ministry of Culture, interface with other co ops, and interface also with co op federations and to collaborate with a lot of other institutions to find work opportunities, to find projects to work on together, and to start getting some money in,
I
because at the end
haven't
of the
seen this
day.
model in North America, so what you're sharing with me is novel, and it's a new way of looking at how to create a studio that allows you to bring stability, visibility, and work with all these different kinds of people and still have that independence.
Yeah.
It's truly something that I've never seen happen here. We have a very different perspective. And so I think opening this kind of mindset to working with government, finding alternatives to creating business is truly an interesting path.
Yeah. I think, video game development, especially at an indie scale where you have maybe between 4 to 20 people at the studio, it is very naturally aligned, I think, to cooperativism. If you're creating a work of art, a video game, that has to have a single cohesive vision. But labor production requires specialists from different disciplines like programmers, artists, writers, level designers, musicians, who are all bringing in their own knowledge and authorship and authority in their chosen discipline. And the only way to align all these visions is through conversation and consensus and a democratic horizontal approach. And this is what a cooperative protects. A cooperative turns that approach and that consensus dialogue based production model into the legal model through which the studio runs. That cannot later be upturned in kind of very hierarchical system in which some people are part owners of this production model and everybody else is just a worker that is beholden to their vision. And I think, in a lot of
Make it sound
indie,
so rough.
well, it can be very rough, but I think indie game development tends to be this horizontal in this way already. And so a co-op model is, in a lot of ways, is a natural extension of that, of protecting this way of working. And it was certainly the way that we had worked as a collective throughout all those years before we became a co-op. So when we decided to formalize, we thought a co-op would actually allow us to enshrine this way that we've been working in a legal way, so that we can continue to operate this way, and that is not endangered later down the line.
For someone who's listening, who's thinking about, well, what if I started a co-op? Uh, what are some of the things that you really learned that you'd like to share? Do's, things to follow,
Mhm.
maybe some don'ts.
So I think co-ops are a great way to create a company, and I think a great way to empower yourself and your coworkers into having a lot of agency and having a lot of responsibility about the work you're creating and the work environment that you're creating. At the same time, it's still a business, and that means that the business has to function. It needs to have money coming in, it needs to pay taxes, it needs to have bookkeeping, it needs to have a joint bank account that someone is taking care of. And for any new company, whether it's a co-op or not, you need to know about all these things, and you need to make sure that within your team there are people who can take care of these tasks, which are very big. And for a lot of us coming from video games who don't know about any of these things, it requires a lot of learning if you want to take care of them in house and not hire extra people. And I think a lot of people are drawn to co-ops ideologically, because ideologically they're very romantic and they sound great. But at the end of the day, you still have to interact with capitalism and interact, with business. And so it's very important to have a business that is actually working and that is stable for everyone involved, and that there is money coming in and coming out. So I would definitely say don't get ahead of yourself. Make sure that you start the co-op when you need the co-op, and that the business that is undergirding all of this is working already and has strong legs before you formalize, because otherwise you're going to take on all this extra workload and there won't be anything that will sustain you through that process. The other thing is that communication is extremely important in co-ops, because you all need to be involved to make decisions. And it's very common in co-ops that some people who have maybe a little more motivation or understand the business side or the administrative side a little well end up overburdened with work, because other people just aren't as motivated to participate. Especially if you're running a very small studio where you don't necessarily have people who only do administration as their work or only do marketing as their work, and you have to spread these tasks out. If there isn't active communication and there isn't active participation from everyone to make sure that these tasks are balanced out fairly and that everyone is doing a bit, it can be very common for a few individuals to take on the brunt of that work. And that can be very difficult. But this also happens in non co op studios as
No,
well,
of
in any
course.
small company.
There's burnout, there's politics, there's a million things.
Yeah.
Um, when you decided as a team, as a co-op, to formally dissolve the structure, do you still find that you took a lot from that? I mean, I assume that you took a lot from that.
Yeah, we closed the co-op last year after a very fruitful run. As a whole, lasted 8 years, and the 15th of March of last year, we decided we wanted to split up as a group, kind of like a rock band splits up, not because of any big conflicts within the co-op or within our social group, but simply we each want to pursue the same ideas and the same interests we had always had in slightly different ways. And it was becoming difficult, I think, towards the end for us to have a singular conversation that kept us all motivated, moving in the same direction. And instead of trying to resist that entropy, at a certain point, we felt it was too much work. And we said, if we don't feel like continuing this together, let's just each go our own ways and be amicable about it. And I think one of the things that we were able to demonstrate that way is that company or studio closing doesn't have to be this big, terrible, disastrous thing. It can be a conversation like anything else, and it can be kind of healthy. So I think we all learned a lot from both the experience of creating a co-op, of being a co-op, of learning about cooperativism and working together as a studio with clients, of collaborating with institutions, creating more ambitious games and bigger games that we had ever created as a collective and individually. And I certainly learned a lot. I produced 4 games under the span of a year, more or less, and did admin for this new company and really learned a lot. And we all took a lot also from the collective, from being Matajuegos. But I think Matajuegos was also born in 2015, 2016, and it really responded to a particular cultural moment. And we were all different people, and we began the collective. And the truth is that people change, and people should have the freedom and the right to move apart and to try new things. And I think that's what we wanted to give each other at the end. And we, we're still friends. We still talk to each other. We still collaborate occasionally on different projects. This isn't to say that it was easy and that there weren't difficult conversations and there weren't difficult discussions, that some of us didn't feel strong emotions at different moments in time, but that is part of all relationships, I think.
I think so.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the game a little bit because you created a new genre, a documentary, surreal, hyperlocal game. And I have never seen anything quite like it. So, how did you approach? Who approached who? How did you come up with this idea of doing it as a documentary video game and the aesthetic? There's just so many questions.
Yeah, so at 12, I don't know if I'd go as far as saying we created a new genre, although I definitely appreciate the enthusiasm. But 12 is a very particular work. And the way it started was we were approached by a group of documentarians called the 1201 Project, or a group of international documentarians who create generally film documentaries about climate change, social conservation, and social change. And some of them are based in England, some of it are based in South Africa, but a group of them was based here in Argentina. And they were filming a documentary about the Atuel River. And they had traveled across all 550 kilometers of it, from where it's born up in the Andes Mountains to where it kind of dries out in the Pampas. And they had filmed some incredible views of this desert landscape, and they had recorded a lot of interviews with specialists and people who just have been lived alongside the river for most of their lives, talking about the past, the present, and the future of this river, and the relationship that the local communities have to it, and how it's all being threatened by the climate crisis. And they approached us because they had received a subsidy, some funding to create a video game alongside the documentary movie that they were going to release. They were in post production of this movie when they got in touch with us, and we talked with them briefly about what their ideas were for creating this game. And what we ended up proposing to them was their documentary. It had these gorgeous views of the landscape, these beautiful photorealist shots, close ups of the people being interviewed. And the narrative explained the origins of the river, the issues with it, and it was very rational. And we thought, well, if we're going to make a game, we don't want to do the same thing they're already doing in the film. Let's make something that's completely different and that in this way complements the filmmaking and gives a different perspective on these same issues. So what we proposed was that if the film documentary was the waking reality of the river, then the game should be it's a dream of the river, what the river dreams of when it sleeps. It's subconscious to an extent. And so we discarded the photorealism, and what we ended up making was a game that reinterprets a lot of these interviews, grabs clips of them and rearranges them in a different order in order to create a meditative and reflexive experience in which you kind of have to interpret what is happening and what the interviews are telling you. And it is not rational but emotive. You relate to it through its emotionality and through your interpretation of what is happening and what the interviews are talking about. Because the interviews aren't specific in the way they are in the documentary movie, they're more evocative and general. And a lot of what the game is doing is trying to create this intrigue, this mystery for you to fall into, to create this interpretive game space in which you're drawn in to kind of figure out what is happening. And you're creating this evocative emotional connection with the river and what these people are talking about, all while having this very ecocentric perspective of the river because you play as non-human elements of the ecosystem.
How is human conflict dealt with, like water rights and things like that?
So in the game, several of the interviews talk about the negative impact of man on the natural ecosystem, and there's moments in the game in which you are faced with forest fires and drought, and it is left open to an extent to what do you make of that as a player. But I think even though the game is very local and the interviews are all in not only in Spanish but in the Spanish of this particular place in Argentina. So it's not even the Spanish that we speak in Buenos Aires, but it's a Spanish with a very local accent. and with the kind of very local perspective, it is also asking you what is your relationship with the local fresh water around you, the lakes and the rivers that are the base of the society and the place that you inhabit.
I have always lived next to a large body of water, and it's such an amazing thing that when you look at history and how communities develop, they always develop around a body of water, of course.
Yeah.
And it's so important to think about how we as a society come together and what that meaning is about the fact that we all congregate around this simple idea of we need this for sustenance, and that man over time has forgotten that we need to sustain the river too.
Yeah, and this is the relationship that is at the base of the narrative of Atuel. It is about this historic and very intimate relationship that we as a human society have with the river. And the idea that the river is not just a channel of water, but it is a channel of life, and that we are part of this ecosystem. Even though we may imagine ourselves to be outside of it and over it, we're also part of this ecosystem and this interconnection of life that the river is at the basis of.
Now, you talk about hyperlocal and you spoke about the different accents and things like that. However, what else makes something hyperlocal, and what does hyperlocal mean to you?
So the issues that Atuel deals with, water scarcity, the climate crisis, drought, the impact of man on nature, are universal issues that we're all close to. But Atuel focuses on the details of the impacts in a very specific place and to very specific people. And I think by centering on these very specific stories, that impact is felt all the more. And by being hyperlocal and not, for example, we don't have any dubbing on these interviews. We keep them in their original Spanish and we keep them with their original accents as they were spoken by the people interviewed. None of the interviewers explain their culture, where they come from, or give any explanation. We show this unashamedly, and we want the player to feel curious and intrigued by this place and these people that they don't know and they haven't heard of, because most games and even most documentaries, most films are about the global north, or they're about the big picture, but they're not about these far out, marginalized places. And we may think for something to have a mass appeal, it has to be about something that we all know. I think, on the contrary, I think we are very drawn to places we don't know and people we don't know. And we're very curious about the stories of people we haven't met. And I think it's important to tell those stories. And it's important, I think, for people from unknown places to really feel confident about being able to tell their stories and create their own imaginaries, rather than to have to try to play at the mass market, mass appeal imaginaries that we are taught to appeal to in commercial industries and in entertainment, so to speak. And I think this has worked to Atuel's advantage. When Atuel is shown at festivals, in galleries, and in museums, it is in great part because there is an interest in these stories.
Did you imagine when you started the project that you would be creating a museum piece?
Not at all, not at all. 12 is a very small project. It's a game that only lasts 20 to 30 minutes. It is very easy to play. It's not a very complicated game. It was made by a very small team with a very small budget. And we made it for a very general Latin American audience. We did not think of making it for gamers. It's a free game, and we wanted it to be as accessible as possible. But this also meant that by being so accessible and by being so multifaceted, it was very easy for a lot of different curators to fit into their curational frames. What I mean is, for a science museum, Atuel is relevant because it talks about the climate crisis. For an art gallery, Atuel is interesting because it is beautiful in the way it treats surrealist art in a video game, and as interactive art, it's interesting. For a design museum, it was interesting how Atuel puts together the documentary genre with a video game format. And for a documentary festival, it's interesting because it's a different way to approach the genre. And it is a very easy game to display. It doesn't require very big technical installation or set piece. It's just a computer, and it can be played with a keyboard or with any gamepad. It doesn't have very big technical requirements to run, even though it's very beautiful to look at. So it's not an expensive game to display. And I think because of all these factors, curators were really drawn to it. It's still being shown at very diverse places to this day. It was just in Seoul at Out of Index, which is an experimental games festival. in Korea. It will be shown in Sao Paulo in the second half of this month by Fundación Itaú, which is a very large cultural institution in South America. But it's been shown at the Smithsonian National Art Museum in Washington D.C. It's been shown at the Design Museum in Atlanta. It was at the Cannes Film Festival. It's been in a lot of very different places because I think it's interesting to a lot of different communities and disciplines. We definitely did not think about that. This is all new to us. We had really not been shown at festivals very much before this. Definitely not been shown at museums. None of our work had been presented in these kind of spaces before. So with Atuel, it was a learning experience for us. And I think it's part of a big wave of interest in new media art experiences by different cultural institutions.
I am of the mind that there are many games that belong in museums as they are both visually stunning and say something so provocative that creates an emotional response. And to me, that's art. And I think you successfully did that with your game. It's beautiful. And although I don't speak Spanish, I still felt like I understood what was going on in playing the game. It definitely is an experience, and I highly recommend if anybody's out there listening and wants to play this game, it's found easily on itch.io.
Yeah. It's also on Steam and on Google Play if anyone's
Oh,
interested, and
good,
it's
good.
free on all those platforms.
Wonderful. Now, let's move on to identity, politics, and culture, because you're right at the center of all of those things. And you're actually like a tuning instrument to culture, and you allow us to see into some of these things that we haven't. What kind of stories are you interested in telling, and what are you looking to work on and fight for in the future?
Um, a lot of the work we've done in Matajuegos and that I've collaborated on has to do with Latin American social issues and cultural issues that are very close to my life experience and to the life experience of the people that I call my friends and my peers. And I don't think the issues that I've been drawn to working on have changed really since I started being part of Matajuegos in 2016. And I think they're going to continue along those lines. One of the things that I'm very interested in since we worked on Atuel is seeing how we can talk about neocolonialism by talking about the climate crisis. And what I mean by this is, in the last few years here in Argentina, there has been a big incentive by government to invite large companies from the global north, from the United States, from China, but from elsewhere as well, to fund extractivist projects like mining for lithium, for copper in very big swathes of Argentinian land that are legally owned by native communities and which are protected. But these resources, these minerals, are very sought after as part of the shift in industry towards green energy. And there is a very complicated and intriguing situation that is happening both on a very local level, in which a lot of these native communities are being pushed off this land in order to make space for these mining operations, which are also very damaging to the local environment. But at the same time, you have very big companies continuing politics of imperialism and neocolonialism, in which Argentina and the global south are places to draw resources from without any interest in developing these regions for the people who are from these regions to profit from this extraction or have a decision in these extractions. And I think in the same way that Atuel kind of talks about the climate crisis, global issue, by talking about a very specific place, I am wondering if there's a story that we can tell through games about this situation that's happening in Argentina. But this is maybe a more ambitious project. But I'm also continuing to see a lot of Argentinian developers in these last few years start to make games about Argentinian politics, about Argentinian culture, about their lives. And I'm very inspired by their work. And I think this is pushed by public universities teaching video game development. And this has meant that a lot of people who didn't have access to game development as a means of expression have started expressing themselves through games and creating a lot of non commercial kind of indie games that have really made the local indie scene a lot more colorful and flavorful, and a lot of different experiences are coming to the surface in local games.
I think that Latin America has wanted to recreate these stories that were already started in North America or Europe about world wars and things like that. And I'm like, no, you have so many amazing stories, cultural stories, indigenous stories. You have your own histories, and it can be hyper local. And I like the idea of focusing on environment as one. Have you focused on other areas besides environment?
Yeah, so in Matajuegos, we had several projects that dealt with queerness, queer identity, trans identity. We had several projects that were about feminist issues. In 2015 and 2016, when Matajuegos started, it was in the peak of Ni Una Menos. Ni Una Menos was a huge feminist marches and feminist association fighting the amount of women who are being murdered in the country, and to speak about these issues and to speak about misogyny and the violence that occurs there. And members of Matajuegos made games about their experiences at these marches and their own personal experiences. And we also made games, for example, promoting and supporting the marches that were happening to fight for the legalization of abortion in Argentina in 2018 and 2020 when it finally passed. We made virtual marches for people who couldn't go to the street to send in their avatars to march virtually alongside them. And we've also made games about Argentine literature and about Argentine culture in general as well. And these are all issues, yeah, that have come up in my work and the work of the collective in general.
And yourself, how do you want to see a future for you? Where are you growing?
I'm going to continue to try to find funding for these kind of games and to make these kind of games. But I also do freelance work for all kinds of narrative projects and as a producer for other indie games and larger commercial games. And I see myself continuing to do this work. And I find that even though my heart is very much set on indie experimental artistic games, I learn a lot from working in the industry and working on commercial projects. And a lot of what I learned there and working on those projects are things that I can bring back to these smaller, more creative endeavors. I would love to do some curatorship in the future and put on some exhibits, but I think this is maybe further down the line once I find the right partners to collaborate with and learn from. Yeah.
As Matajuegos was the first game co-op, are you helping mentor new game co-ops? Are there new game co-ops?
Yeah, so in Argentina, since Metafor was funded, there are now about 10 video game co ops in the country. And I have spoken with most of them, and I helped several of them make this decision whether to incorporate as a co op or to incorporate as a different kind of legal entity. And I've helped several of them just understand what you need to run as a co op, from the bureaucracy around it to formalize and get everything set up to start out and get all the paperwork in.
Are co-ops a common thing in other Latin American countries as well?
I think it very much depends on the country and its history. In Argentina, we have a long history of co ops, which very much started as ways for immigrant groups who were coming to Argentina to gather money collectively to better their neighborhoods and to improve their living situations as a community. And then it went from there into different spaces. But for example, 70% of the electricity in the country is run by community and community-based energy co-ops. There's a lot of farming co-ops, there's a lot of industrial co-ops. And I think it really depends on the history of the country and how the governments in those countries have promoted or not promoted cooperativism. And I think co-ops as an alternative model to the capitalist system of running business are still very much alive and still proposing an alternative. And the end goal of cooperativism and all cooperatives is sustainability rather than profit, and to create a world in which we can all make a livable wage and have dignity in our work. And even in countries where co ops are difficult to create for legal reasons, a lot of workers still run as co ops in practical terms. You know?
If funding and policy would align the way you wanted, what kind of ecosystem around co-ops and experimental studios would you like to see in the region, if not in general in game development around the world?
Yeah, so around the world, we're at a very difficult moment for the games industry. It's very, very hard to find financing for new games. Publishers are very risk averse. There's been a ton of layoffs. And the marketplaces that we depend on to get our games out to our public are monopolized, and it's very hard for our games to be seen. I think it would be great, especially locally, to have more government funding for games. In the same way that government funds art and funds culture, I think the kind of games that I'm interested in, cultural games, social games, games that don't necessarily have a commercial angle or could be feasible commercially, but would still be meaningful. I think they need a means of funding and an alternative means of funding. And I think it would be great to see that in general all over the world, as well as alternative platforms, so that we're not all cramped into Steam, who is very much decided to promote the biggest games and the popular games and not really make a space for creative indie games.
Understandable. If you were to connect the dots between all of the things that you've done, the co-op, climate, hyperlocal documentary, games, what's the through line of everything so far in your story?
It's hard to narrow it down, but I think we live, unfortunately, in a society where human dignity is not as valued as it should be in all kinds of ways. Co-ops are a way to bring human dignity back to work that we have often lost in a lot of places and a lot of kinds of means of employment. And the work that we've done around queer identity is also a way to display human dignity in a political social situations where queerness and transness is very often treated as something that is not worth respect or dignity, and so on. I think about this in the ways that I approach work. It's to value the dignity of others. And obviously, it's a very high minded and idealist thing to say, but it's very hard to find a through line that isn't very high minded and very large. If you
No,
just
but it's a
define.
beautiful statement to think that your life is connected by how you treat others. It's truly a life full of drive and passion. And that really says a lot about you as a human. As we start to wrap this conversation up, what would you like to leave us with? Where would you like people to be looking at your work? Would you like them to contact you? What are you looking to do for your future?
So if you still want to hear more from me, you can find me as PF Quarta, that's PFQUARTA, on just about any social media. Feel free to ping me or to email me at pfquarta@gmail. But mostly, if you're intrigued by Atuel, I invite you to download it. It's a very small time commitment, 20 to 30 minutes. It's a very relaxing game. You can play it with a nice, relaxing drink, with some nice headphones on to listen to the sound and to the music. And if you like it, please leave us a review either on itch, or on Steam, or on Google Play. It really helps us out a lot. And I'm going to be looking for work opportunities, doing narrative design and game design and production. So, if from what you hear you'd be interested in working with me, let me know. I'm very interested in listening to opportunities for collaboration for 2026 and 2027. And yeah, I've spoken at a lot of conferences and festivals these last 2 3 years. And if you're looking for speakers, let me know. Maybe we can make it happen. Maybe not.
Absolutely. I think that what you really bring to the table, my friend, is this honesty about dealing with our problems and finding novel ways to approach introducing these concepts to people that are just not aware. It's not a part of their consciousness. And the idea that to play through this game, but at the same time have my mind thinking, now, mind you, I don't speak Spanish, so it's very hard for me to get all the nuances, but you get the intonation, you understand what's building, what's happening, and you don't have to have a common language. You could have it's a common emotion. And that way of being able to communicate with the world around you, you're truly gifted. And I think your team and the people that worked on this, the thought that went into this game is truly poetic. And I really feel like you've given the world something worthy of 30 minutes, if not more. I think once they play, it'll be a lifetime of thinking. And that is a gift.
Thank you, Susan. That's very kind of you to say. Thank you.
I, I don't know many people that can do that. And I live in a world where I only am looking for people who can make effective change. I want people to be out there finding alternative ways to communicate and share stories, and that we can do it through games, truly unique and a beautiful experience. And I highly recommend our listeners to go play and watch it. And I want to thank you very much, Pablo, for your time today, for sharing this journey, not just down a river, but through life. It's truly been an honor to meet you and get to know you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thanks to everyone who's been listening. If you take anything away from this, I hope it is to make your own hyperlocal games about the places you live in and the places you inhabit and the stories only you can tell.
That would be truly beautiful. I hope they listen. Thank you so much, Pablo. Bye bye.
Bye.
Want to get involved with the GGJ podcast? We'd love to hear from you. Please send your ideas, suggestions, and questions to ggjpod@globalgamejam.org and tell us who you think we should be talking to next, what stories or issues matter most to you about the future of games, and help us highlight the people and practices that make a sustainable creative life in games possible. Thank you for spending time with us on the GGJ podcast. If this conversation sparked something for you, please share it with someone who might find it useful. And don't forget to follow along so you never miss new stories from makers around the world. You can find more episodes, resources, and information about the Global Game Jam at globalgamejam.org. Catch us on Substack and on YouTube and anywhere else you find podcasts. This has been the GGJ podcast. Thanks for listening and keep making games.